Hello, this is Ryan Olkey with Awakening in Life. Recently, I recorded and wrote a succinct overview of what the path and training of Awakening in Life is. And this overview is part descriptive and part poetic in nature. And what I wanted to do in this recording was to take a more free-form commentary to unpack some of the things I said in that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the succinct overview again right here. And then we're going to go somewhat line by line and unpack what it is that I meant there and what it might mean for practice and what it might mean for our life. So here is the succinct overview to begin. Our awakening begins with ourselves, as we are nakedly in this moment. But if our awakening is to be for more than ourselves, then we must embrace our life and the world threefold. 1, as an opportunity to awaken. 2, what we are awakening through. And 3, what we are awakening for. The Bodhisattva ideal of serving others requires us to not just awaken to timeless wisdom, but also to embrace the kaleidoscope of our living embodiment in this life, an embodiment which includes ourselves, others, and the world, an awakening that includes everything. Awakening in life is a path of returning home to ourselves again and again, with radical curiosity, working with our living experience, both embodying and realizing timeless presence, and in real time, embodying all of who we have been and who we are becoming, bringing to light those parts of our being that were too difficult to hold in the past, and welcoming our individual and collective unfolding, embracing and penetrating the mystery of this life as we and it change, to make sense of it all as best we can for the purpose of a most appropriate response, moment to moment. A path of awakening in life is showing up more fully like this, more capable of responding to the complexity and challenges of our lives and of the world, and to remember and root ourselves in that which is most good, beautiful, and true. So that's the overview. So let's start at the beginning here. In this first line, I say that our awakening begins with ourselves as we are nakedly in this moment. But of course, as you heard, I quickly start talking about our awakening being more than for ourselves and also embracing our life and the unfolding of our life, which goes beyond this first sentence of just being with ourselves and just being with ourselves nakedly as we are in this moment. But it really is a starting point, the starting point for a path of awakening, especially classical awakening. And I want to read you 2 brief passages from a couple of my favorite teachings. So this first short passage is from one of my all-time favorite teachings called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. And this is a text that's actually from Padmasambhava, or known in the Tibetan tradition as Guru Rinpoche. And it's also part of the cycle of the Tibetan teachings of living and dying, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, depending on how you like to translate that. So this passage here is one of my favorite. Now, when you are introduced to your own intrinsic awareness, the method for entering into it involves 3 considerations. Thoughts in the past are clear and empty and leave no traces behind. Thoughts in the future are fresh and unconditioned by anything. And in the present moment, when your mind remains in its own condition without constructing anything, awareness at that moment in itself is quite ordinary. And when you look into yourself in this way nakedly, without any discursive thoughts, since there is only this pure observing, there will be found a lucid clarity without anyone being there who is the observer. Only a naked manifest awareness is present. And now, another short one from Namkhai Norbu's book, Sogjin, The Self-Perfected State. This is actually, he includes what's called the 6 Vajra verses. So, the 6 Vajra verses. The nature of phenomena is non-dual, but each one, in its own state, is beyond the limits of the mind. There is no concept that can define the condition of what is, but vision nevertheless manifests. All is good. Everything has already been accomplished, and so, having overcome the sickness of effort, one finds oneself in the self-perfected state. This is contemplation. So here, briefly, again, these are 2 of my personal favorites, but there's so many different ways to talk about it, and there can be much more than just even what's included in these 2 passages that these passages are pointing to. But here, when I use the phrase nakedly in this moment, I am particularly invoking some language from the Sogjen tradition because I personally like it. But here, we're talking about awakening being an experience and a path or a process of being with ourselves and being with things as we are, most directly, most nakedly. Said another way, we're not really trying to do anything with our experience at all, just directly be present with things as they are, where there's nothing being contrived, there's no separation, there's no distance between ourselves and our experience. And we can say this a bunch of different ways. Now, the first passage I read from Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness, this pointed to somewhat of a first-person perspective of our own manifest awareness being present. And we're looking at thoughts and the nature of thoughts to find out what that actually is. The second passage I read from the 6 Vajra verses sort of point out a third-person perspective of things, of the world, of how things are. And here saying that they're non-dual or they're beyond any description of anything that words can embody or point to. And it also points out to realize this so directly that we give up effort. Both of these passages are basically speaking to that we practice until we realize that we don't need to do anything to have this direct experience, to have this kind of awakening. So here, when we're talking, this is going to be in somewhat contrast to some of the other things I've said later in the succinct overview, particularly about embracing our life and the unfolding of our life and trying to understand it and embody it and deal with the actual content of our reality, of our life, and to respond to it. So we are waking up to things as they are, unconditioned, uncontrived, nakedly, and we're not particularly doing any sort of response at the moment. But of course, we have the Bodhisattva ideal, which is that even though we can awaken for ourselves, we don't just stop there. We want to help others to awaken to that same naked, unconditioned, uncontrived experience. And so we have to engage the world. We have to engage others to help others, even in this grand ideal of the Bodhisattva as it's taught in the tradition in Buddhism. Now, for awakening life, the next sentence here, I say that if our awakening is to be more than just for ourselves, we have to embrace our life in the world in 3 ways. One is as our opportunity to awaken. So this first point of embracing our life in the world as our opportunity to awaken, this means very simply that we don't have to go and find any special conditions in order to awaken. Wherever we're at, we can awaken right there. And then the second point, what we are awakening through, means that we can actually take our life, we can take any experience that we're having, especially and including our daily life, we can take that as our practice. We can awaken through any experience. So not only do we not have to find a special condition or a special environment to wake up, we don't have to find special experiences to practice through. We definitely will take up specific practices and techniques throughout our path and throughout our life that are helpful for us to cultivate certain qualities and certain capacities to have certain insights and realizations. And then last, we're embracing our life in the world for what we are awakening for. Obviously in Buddhism, there is first the idea of being an arhat, where you wake up just for yourself. And as I mentioned before, you can then take that a step further and wake up for the sake of other beings. You can wake up to help others awaken. And that's the Bodhisattva ideal. So already we are awakening for more than just ourselves. But here, when I mean embrace our life in the world for what we are awakening for, I mean everything. For others, for ourselves, for the world, for the planet. We can include all of this as our reason and purpose for awakening, for taking up a path of awakening. And then the next line here, the Bodhisattva ideal of serving others requires us to not just awaken to timeless wisdom, but also to embrace the kaleidoscope of our living embodiment in this life. An embodiment which includes ourselves, others in the world, an awakening that includes everything. So here, I'm starting to talk about the difference between timeless wisdom and, as I've described, as a kaleidoscope of our living embodiment, meaning that, as I read in some of these first passages here from these texts, when we wake up in the classical sense, we're waking up to things as they are, as they always are. They're always like this. We are always like this. in terms of this naked awareness, this naked presence. However, manifest life that's changing and evolving, there are patterns to this existence. There are experiences of suffering, there's experiences of joy, and we can have an impact on that. Even if we can see through it in a certain way and say, well, these experiences are empty, these experiences are impermanent, they're arising and passing. These are all true, and we all have a lived experience where things matter. And here, this is where compassion really comes online, to really realize this, that even though we are awakening, or even if we have awoken in the classical sense, there's still more that matters. And so we are embracing both this awakening to timeless wisdom, because this is part of our experience. This is part of who we are. But we're not just stopping there. We want to embrace this kaleidoscope of life. And minimally, if we want to generalize, it includes ourselves, others in the world. And I say boldly that it includes everything. And I don't mean in a perfection sort of way. It just means that everything is here. This is all part of our experience. If we're experiencing something, that's included. So there's nothing that we ever need to exclude and say this is not part of our path. We very much might want to respond and change things in our experience. But we do that by first recognizing and including that as part of our path. Now, the next line, awakening in life is a path of returning home to ourselves again and again with radical curiosity, working with our living experience, both embodying, realizing timeless presence, and in real time, embodying all of who we have been and who we are becoming. So I'm going to pause there because honestly, I wrote a really long sentence, but it works well enough, at least in audio form. So here, a path of returning home to ourselves again and again. This is both returning home to what we always are in terms of what we described about this naked presence, this naked awareness. We return home in that sense. And we also return home to ourselves in how we are unfolding and how we are embodied, how our relationships in the world and the world we're a part of, how this is unfolding. And what does it mean to leave home? Well, leaving home might mean, we can describe in different ways in which we become unconscious, unaware, or honestly, where we discover new things that weren't in our awareness. This returning home is returning back to presence, to notice what we notice, to experience what we experience with more presence. And radical curiosity is a term that I use a lot. It's core to everything I practice and teach. And radical curiosity has a sense of engaging our experience. We're not just witnessing things in a radical openness, we're also engaging with it with a curiosity. And curiosity doesn't mean pleasurable or of an approving nature. It means engaged. And it means engage in a way where we're not shutting down what we're experiencing and being curious about. Again, up until the point where a response arises. So we might want to change things, and we might have influence to change things in our life or in the world. But again, it starts with a radical curiosity, because we can much more intimately know ourselves and others in the world by doing that. And again, we are working with our living experience. So this unfolding, this real-time experience. And I say that we're embodying all of who we have been and who we are becoming. So again, this is a little bit in contrast to a classical awakening, where we're awakening to that which is timeless, that which is always true. So whether that's emptiness, no self, non-duality, whatever words we might use, Buddha nature, things like this. Here, we're also engaging the past. We're engaging in learning from our past. On an individual level, this could be coming home to ourselves and experiencing things that we might have shut off in ourselves from the past, maybe from traumatic experiences, and with compassion and curiosity, with patience, with support from others, we go back into the past to learn, to heal, and to take forward any wisdom into the present moment and the future. And then when we talk about who we are becoming, this is, I think, pretty easy to look at in the world, where we have A lot of us are experiencing a lot of challenge, terror, and fear in the world, and we want to know where this is all going, and we want to have an influence on it. So we're embracing that too. Who are we? Who are we now? Who have we been? And who are we becoming? And having this radical, curious embrace in this moment to be present to that and to have a response. And here, talking about this a little bit more, I say bringing to light those parts of our being that were too difficult to hold in the past, individually and collectively. This is our opportunity to, in whatever we can, to start being curious and going back and reclaiming ways in which we might feel fragmented in ourselves or in society or in relationships, and begin to bring it to light, to bring compassion and wisdom to bear on those past experiences, because those past experiences are showing up in this present moment. These past experiences impact our embodiment right now. And then I say, and welcoming our individual and collective unfolding. So again, it's not just about us as individuals, it's about all of us together, again, in your personal life and relationships and ourselves as part of this world. Embracing and penetrating the mystery of this life as we in it change. Again, we are embracing in an open, curious sense things as they are, and then trying to deeply engage and understand our experience individually and collectively, because we're changing. Everything is changing in the world and ourselves, and we can be present to that. And if we're present to that, we can have an impact. We can have a compassionate, wise response. And that leads to the next part of this, to make sense of it all as best we can for the purpose of a most appropriate response moment to moment. So here, I try to be very direct to say that we want to have a response right now, but we're going to do the best we can, which kind of tempers a little bit of idealism or perfectionism, and especially when we also include a classic path of awakening, where we are working in our practice to awaken to things that we might call a self-perfected state. It's very easy to apply that experience or ideal to our lived unfolding existence, which doesn't have that quality of perfection on the gross manifest level. So we do the best we can. In my belief, in my experience, is that if we're as present as we can be through a practice and path of awakening in life, we will be doing the best we can in that moment. And this phrase, the most appropriate response, is a reference to a Zen koan. It's very short. It goes like this. A monk asks Yun Min, "What are the teachings of a whole lifetime?" And Yun Min said, "An appropriate response." Sometimes it's translated as an appropriate statement, but I like it as an appropriate response. And I love that because it bridges the gap between classical awakening and awakening in life, embodying and embracing our lived experience. So here, why are we practicing? Why are we doing any of this? Well, a nice way of saying it is an appropriate response for our personal life, for our relationships, for our community, for our work, for our countries and the world we're a part of. And then finally, a path of awakening in life is showing up more fully like this, more capable of responding to the complexity and challenges of life and of the world, and to remember and root ourselves in that which is most good, beautiful, and true. So here in particular, I'm calling out the complexity and challenges of our lives in the world, because things are not nice and neat and easy as much as we would like them to be. And that might be stating the obvious, but some days it feels like that even when we look at the world, we might have a particular response that we think is perfect and would solve all the problems, and we don't understand why other people don't get it. But that, even if that were true, the why don't people get it is part of the complexity. And most of the time, in my experience, it's not simply that we just understand everything about the world. That's why we need each other to collectively contribute and solve these difficult problems of the world. And even in our own lives, when it feels like it's an own individual problem, we thrive so much more with the support of others. And this last part of remembering and rooting ourselves in that which is most good, beautiful, and true, this is one, a shout to the philosopher Ken Wilber, who's been influential in my life. And the purpose why I've included it in here is because, well, for a few reasons. One is that even as we're dealing with this complexity of life, we can root ourselves in one, this classical awakening that we've been talking about, this experience of what is always true, what is always already perfected in this moment. We can return to that, the stillness of the mind, the open nature of awareness, resting in presence. We can return to that, even in the midst of all the complexity and challenges. And we can also orient, almost like a compass, of what we find to be deeply good in the world, morally speaking, and what is beautiful, subjectively. What do we find beautiful? What inspires us on a deep level? And what do we find is true? What is true in the world? Now, these could be defined in any number of ways, and it turns out that these things can change and evolve in our lives. And that's part of also being with the complexity. But at any given moment, we usually have some orientation to good, beautiful, and true. And this can really help us in difficult moments to return back to. And overall, if you're familiar with the work of Ken Wilber and the integral approach or anything that's like that, because other people have discussed this, it's very central and core to my life and to the path of awakening in life, where we are embracing everything and trying to make sense out of it for the sake of having a more appropriate response. So that's why we are not just awakening on the cushion. We are not just awakening to timeless presence. We're also trying to figure out the best way to understand and engage our lives in the world and others so that we can cultivate more wisdom, more compassion, more joy in life and in the world. And when we embrace a path like this that I'm describing here as in calling awakening in life, we feel less likely that we are leaving something out of our experience. We feel less tension. I'm not saying we don't feel tension, because we most definitely do, because that is part of life. But particularly for people who have come to a path of awakening, a path of enlightenment, path of Buddhist meditation, sometimes we can feel an extra tension of understanding, how does this path of meditation, path of awakening relate to my lived experience, and vice versa. And so here, when we embrace this, we can relax a little bit, and at the same time, we can be much more engaged with less effort in a certain way. We'll still be putting out effort to show up in life, but things get a little simpler even as we dive into more complexity. So I thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I invite you into the Awakening Life training, which you can find at www.awakening.training.